Well, hello. So for those of you who don't know us, my name is Caitlin and with me is Alicia. And we're demonstrators from SCIE1002 and we have been since the start of the course. So we've actually been involved in both demonstrating, marking, as well as content creation for the lab design since last year. And today we're going to be discussing what is good, what is bad, and what simply can't work in terms of integrating a course into an online environment. A bit of a disclaimer that goes with this is just our opinions as demonstrators from what we've observed and how we've interacted with students. And if this is something that you are doing for next semester, just owing to time constraints, we've really condensed down what we want to say today. So please feel free to come talk to us later if you do have any questions or comments that we haven't really raised today.
So for those of you who don't know, the SCIE1002 course is a relatively new multidisciplinary course. It started last year, and over the span of 11 weeks of lab work, the students explore 7 different disciplines: environmental science and management, biology, chemistry, psychology, geology, earth sciences, and physics. So with the difference in disciplines, there is a difference in structure of each lab.
In terms of how the course was actually run, up until week 4, we were still running in the lab setting, although we did see a reduction in attendance as COVID started to be a thing. And then after that, we moved fully online. That initial integration step, we had less than a week to prepare the labs for the online transition for weeks 5, 6, and 7. And then it took 2 days to film the lab components for the weeks remaining.
So firstly, we want to talk about what worked for the course, and we are incredibly lucky to say there was a lot of things that worked really well, and we were really fortunate to be able to teach the course in this time. So the first week that transitioned online, luckily, was a dry lab. So it was a chemistry lab where the week prior, the students had already attended the wet lab and obtained all their data, and so the first week online was just going through Excel and showing them how to analyze that data. So that made the transition quite seamless because we were just able to share the Excel file and share screen and show them what to do. At the very beginning of the week, all demonstrators were paid to attend a Blackboard Collaborate training session. So that meant from the get-go, we were all trained on how to effectively teach on Blackboard, using polls to track where students were up to, using breakout groups to break up the class into smaller, more manageable sizes to answer their individual questions, and using screen sharing of both the academic and the student to troubleshoot. This really meant that the academics could focus on teaching the content of the course itself, whereas handling the technical aspects of it would be done by the demonstrators, and we would also be able to answer the questions in the chat because the academics might not always be able to see it.
And so one of the largest benefits of actually moving SCIE online is that during the context of COVID, where everything is very uncertain, there was a large amount of flexibility that was afforded in terms of how students actually interacted with the course. So there was a flexibility in schedules for those that were working from home or had carers and parental leave, where students were able to attend lab sessions that they weren't necessarily enrolled in, and they were also able to repeat sessions to get further clarity on things that they didn't understand. Third option that actually followed this was students were able to actually watch recordings of the lab sessions to, again, clarify any points that they'd missed, or it meant that they didn't have to stick to a set schedule. So those who were affected by having children at home were able to actually do that once they'd gone to bed. Furthermore, we were able to actually just sort of track this student engagement once being online and interaction through maintaining the use of polls, like Alicia said, but also through just generally interacting with the students and at the start of each class, asking how everyone was feeling, how everyone was going, and that actually was received really well by the students.
With all the tools that Caitlin mentioned, if the students still needed extra help, we actually hosted extra help sessions in the first module, which is before the mid-semester break. These were hosted every week that was online. So we had one for week 4, 5, and 6. No, sorry, 5, 6, and 7, and they were hosted at the very end of the week. So students could talk over any questions they had from the class that week, but also get feedback and receive help for their assignments. In the second module, we again had 3 extra help sessions, but instead of having them every week, they were all on the 1 week at the very end of semester and were largely focused on their final report.
So the reason that we believe that SCIE was such a big success in the transition to online is the filming of the lab components. So 3 of the demonstrators that taught last year that were quite familiar with the content actually went into the lab and over 1.5 to 2 days filmed the experiments that were set out within the course manual so that students were able to then follow along in real time what we were doing as though they had conducted it themselves. These videos were both very well directed but also extremely well edited, so it was a seamless transition online, and they were embedded within the Blackboard course so that all anyone had to do was just click the link and be able to see what they were studying for that week. It is important to note though that the most well received of these pracs was actually the one that the academic himself filmed, and that he was able to then banter and connect with his students through this way.
So what we noticed, there were three main things that we noticed that really resulted in a class being very effectively taught. The first thing is when the academics actually turned their camera on. So in our training, we were actually told to have the camera off while sharing screen due to bandwidth issues, but the students actually responded really positively to being able to see the academic in the corner of the screen, know who they were talking to, and engage with them. Another positive for every class was the fact that we made sure students always had something to do within the class, whether that's performing an at-home experiment, whether that's doing data analysis, or whether that's working through questions that we've given them and brainstorming things. There's always something for them to do to keep them engaged. And lastly, we found that when academics broke each 3-hour lab prac into small manageable sections, students were able to follow along and be engaged much more than if we would just tell them what they were doing for the entire class, have them go away, and then come back at the end. So an academic could speak about what the students were doing, what they have to do, gave time for the students to go away and perform that task, reach that small milestone, and then come back, and we made sure that way that students were never left behind and that they stayed engaged.
Unfortunately, though, there were some areas that we saw that were negatively impacted or that were challenging after we moved online. The first and foremost being that the tactile component of the labs was removed. This is obviously important for gaining lab skills, but we actually saw that there was a reduction in awareness, or it was confusing for students to understand the purpose and the context behind practicals. We're saying this because as we've marked both modules, so one module was taught primarily in class and then one was done primarily online, the quality of the report, as in how students have interpreted the data, there was a significant reduction that we saw in that second report that was done online. Furthermore, we saw that students were no longer gaining that independence that we'd been striving to teach them in the first 4 weeks of semester. So students were overly reliant on the demonstrators to provide answers rather than figuring them out or attempting to find them out for themselves, and were very, very willing to sit and wait until one of their peers had posted the answer in the chat rather than doing it themselves.
Another thing that was always bound to break down when you're taking something that's in person and making it online is communication. And there were numerous times throughout the course where students were sometimes a little bit aggressive about the fact that they didn't know what was going on and everything was very uncertain and they weren't sure where they were meant to be up to. So I think one thing to definitely keep in mind with keeping courses online, with having a course online, is that the students actually want so much more in terms of communication and emails. And also this feeling that, you know, they're no longer as connected with us meant that some students actually abused the breakout groups. So some students would very early on in the class demand that they needed to be taken out into a breakout group to have the entire class or all the work explained to them. But in doing so, you remove them from the main class, so then they miss what's happening in the main class. So then you have to get them up to speed with that before you can bring them back.
This communication is also a bit of a two-way street. So obviously in a real class setting, you're able to monitor the progress of your students, both in terms of how far they've progressed through the lab, but also their depth of understanding about what you're covering. This was quite challenging to do online. Through the use of polls and questioning, we were trying to ascertain where our students were up to and who needed help with what, but it was quite difficult because some students were just unwilling to answer these questions. Also, it's impossible to give students the same level of feedback that they would in an ordinary lab context. So typically in a lab, you would have demonstrators and the academic roaming around, engaging with students personally and one-on-one to ensure that they were having a happy time, I guess, in the lab. And unfortunately, we weren't able to provide this one-on-one tailored experience once we moved online.
One thing to definitely keep in mind for our course, in terms of taking a very lab-based course and making it online, is it takes so much longer to teach these classes online. So last year, we had classes that would consistently take 1.5 hours or 2 hours of the 3-hour session to run. This year, those same classes, once online, would consistently take up the entire 3-hour session. And this is keeping in mind that the actual practical aspect of the course was done in a video, so there's not even the time taken for the students to figure out what they're doing in the prac. And a large aspect that made the classes so much longer was the fact that students can't simultaneously watch the lecture and do the work themselves. So in a class setting, you would have the academic up the front, talking them through what to do. The students could follow along. You can't do that online because the students can't have both screens up. Because none of them are then large enough for them to actually do the work. They have to watch the lecture and then go and do the work, and then by the time they've done the work, they've sometimes forgotten. So it becomes a very repetitive process. The other thing to note is that maths and equations are so much harder to teach online. It is more of a visual experience, but students really struggle with understanding how to rearrange them and how to use them.
The last sort of issue that we had, I guess, with SCIE once we moved online is probably the most obvious, and that was technical issues. So despite the fact that we were very supported as demonstrators to get training to use Blackboard to collaborate, it was initially quite impossible to coordinate and manage classes whilst all of us were still unfamiliar with the site. This was then exacerbated when some of us were working from home and in different locations across the campus, so we weren't even able to interact on a personal level to ascertain what we were doing. We also noticed something that we probably should have expected and that we hadn't, is that there is a slight difference between Mac users and Windows users that actually slowed down our teaching experience quite a lot when a student would need technical support that we would be unable to provide because it wasn't the operating system that we were familiar with. And so that is something to keep in mind moving forward, that there might be some challenges with that, particularly in data analysis. We did also notice that there is a significant change in quality in terms of using an open air microphone, such as what we're doing now, and somebody using a headset. And it is our recommendation moving forward that if you are going to be teaching online, to use the headphones with the microphone, as it's just a much greater quality in audio and students find it a lot easier to follow along and understand what's being said. The final sort of technical issue that we've noticed is actually based around the browser use. So Chrome is the only browser that we found worked quite successfully. However, if students needed to move browsers or having other technical issues where they needed to actually leave Blackboard and then return, everything that has happened in the chat disappears. So not only are students missing out on education time where the academic or demonstrators are talking, but they're then missing out on all of that group interaction and collaboration that's occurred at the same time.
So moving on, we have a few points that of things that we thought just really didn't work that well online, but luckily it is a fairly short list. Firstly, that was last year, because our assessment for the course is largely just writing lab reports, we would spend 30 minutes at the end of every class discussing how to write a lab report and how to write scientifically. With the classes going so much longer online, we never actually had enough time to workshop report writing. And even if we did have maybe 10, 15 minutes at the end of class, students were often shy to share what they were struggling with or to share what they were doing. And so that is one thing that is quite difficult to teach online, especially when it's something that has to be trial and errored and really workshopped.
So in terms of this workshopping, something that we're quite proud of in SCIE is our ability to give students personal feedback on their report writing skills so that they can develop as scientists. And unfortunately, what we found is that once we'd moved online, it was not practical to actually take individual drafts and mark these. This is for multiple reasons. The first one being primarily we were just running out of time. Secondly, it actually takes demonstrators out of the academic or teaching space so that we couldn't run technical support for the academic and we couldn't answer questions in the chat. But it's also quite difficult to manage 30 or 40 17-page reports when they're being sent to you as a text document instead of just looking over someone's shoulder when they're writing them in class. So this was actually quite disappointing, and we hope that in future we can work out a way to actually incorporate this back into the course.
So just to close, we wanted to just give a few comments of personal feedback that we've received from the students, and overall it has been really quite positive. Students have come up and said how thankful they are for the extra help sessions because it really clarified a lot of the issues they were having, and yeah, they were just thankful that we could be there for them and were there to answer questions.
What we saw is that students responded best when we were aware of the situation and acted, I guess, with kindness first. We've had multiple students come up to us and tell us that the reason that they thought that this was so successful is that we were aware that they needed some breathing room and that this was a challenge for them, and they really just thanked us for how we engaged with their personal circumstances. So I do think that that is something to just keep in mind, which I'm sure everyone already is. So with that, we'll get off and let everyone else keep talking.
Thank you.